Thank you all for joining us for a very engaging conversation. If you have any questions for Rashad, please write them on question cards that should be on your seat, and they'll be collected and brought up to you. And if you're on YouTube, you can put them in the chat. I think you all know Rashad Robinson is a well-respected social justice leader and organization builder. As a social change strategist, he led the pioneering racial justice organization Color of Change for nearly 14 years, transforming it from a startup into a national force. He also led programs at GLAAD, reshaping media representations of LGBTQ people. I skipped the part about James. I skipped the part about turning off your phone. During the fights to win marriage equality and end discrimination. His new book, From Presence to Power, How to Take on the Fights That Matter and Win, is a hopeful and practical guide to reshaping how we think about power, narratives, and movements. It certainly changed the way I think about narratives. Rashad, welcome and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you. It's so great. So many familiar faces. So many people I love and respect and admire in this room. Thank you all for being here. Yes.
So the book's central distinction, as the title suggests, between presence and power, being seen versus getting things done. Mm-hmm. Can you explain that distinction and tell us about the moment you realized that modern activism was optimizing for the wrong one?
Yeah, there wasn't a single moment when I realized it. It was just sort of the ongoing way in which we were both being driven towards certain types of behavior and actions. I do think there was a moment sort of in between the murder of Trayvon Martin and the uprisings in Ferguson after the murder of Mike Brown, and the rise of Twitter. And people began to mistake followership, the sort of the ways in which newspapers or magazines would sort of anoint someone that had a lot of sort of visibility for actually being able to get anything done. And it was happening at the same time of how people were sort of understanding and metabolizing what was happening with President Obama, this sort of new wave of black activism, sort of people pushing on the old guard, and the ways in which corporations in particular saw this as like a moment, right, where they didn't have to make structural change. They could just sort of tap someone on the shoulder and make them the next leader, or they could identify someone that was more palatable. They may have been saying things that kind of on their face felt radical, but they were not willing to do anything that actually disrupted the system. And so the distinction between presence and power, which is throughout the book, even on the cover. Presence fades on the cover, right? And power is clear because presence does fade. Visibility, retweets, shout-outs from the stage. Power is the ability to change the rules. And so when we mistake changing headlines for changing rules, we get ourselves into a lot of traps, and we spend a lot of time doing things that are not actually worth our time. And we actually do a lot of things asking other people to do things that are not worth their time. And then our movements are then judged through a lens of not being able to get things done when we never even started off on a pathway to get things done.
Right, and the idea of clicktivist. People's like, oh, I shared something, so that was action. The idea of this mind share, the idea of large following somehow means that you're occupying more space and somehow having impact because of it.
And then people will then say, oh, well, then, doing work online is not a good thing. And I'm like, no, like all these are tools. And understanding how we use them inside of a power analysis is incredibly important. The late Julian Bond once told me this story of the Watts line. It's in the appendix section, which will be on the website. But he told me the story of the Watts line, and it was the precursor to the 1-800 number. And they installed the Watts line at the Shaw University office of SNCC. And they installed it because when they were kind of calling from Howard University to Morehouse University, those calls would be intercepted because at the time the calls had to be transferred from operator to operator, and all throughout the South, the operators were largely controlled by the White Citizens Council. So as they were transferring those calls, they got intercepted. So they installed a Watts line, which made sure the call went direct and it didn't have to get transferred.
And you're not saying Watts, Los Angeles.
No,
Watts,
I'm
you're
saying it was wide area telephone.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And I should have been able to know the whole thing. I didn't know I was going to tell this story. And but Watts, had they not had a power analysis about how they were going to do the lunch hour sit-ins, how they were developing leaders, if they did not have a strategy for how they were building a base, how they were dealing with folks when they were under attack, they could have had all the technology in the world. And so overlaying technology over bad strategy, overlaying technology over something that doesn't have a power analysis, it doesn't get you anything further and sometimes can set you back even further. And so in this age, in this attention economy, in this age where we are oftentimes incentivized around a whole lot of things that corporations want us to do, not mistaking presence for power, I think is one of the essential sort of lessons that we should have learned from the past, but one of the things that should guide us as we move towards the future.
So when I was approaching this and reading the book, I thought about presence to power. I thought about inclusion, representation, conversations I've been part of in organizations, whether it's a board, having people of color. But it seems to be you're saying that just being on the board doesn't mean you're in the room, doesn't mean you have power. Or people are on the media, but doesn't mean they have power. In NPR, people look at who's booked on shows, look at the bias, et cetera. So has identity politics somehow created this perception that presence is power, or furthered it?
At times, we would, there was always this idea of you need to diversify a police department. And all of a sudden, diversifying a police department means that the police department is going to somehow treat communities better. And you can have a much more diverse police department with a black police chief and still have all the same problems you had before if you don't actually change the incentive structures, if there's not a different set of rules that can be implemented and held accountable over time. And so, and I know we're going to get to roles and rules at some point, but I know that when, I helped to launch a lot of the work around progressive prosecutors, folks would always say oh, you guys are trying to elect more black prosecutors. And newspapers couldn't even get in their mind. It's just automatically, black organization, more black prosecutors. And I'm well, maybe. Not necessarily.
Jason Boudin in this city was not
Actually, and I had to go on Philadelphia Black Radio to explain why we had endorsed Larry Krasner over the black candidate. And because
how'd that go?
It went fine because Larry Krasner got elected. Larry Krasner had spent time defending Black Lives Matter and Occupy. It went fine once we explained to people what we were doing and why it was important. But you actually have to go out and explain to people. And if you short track it, if you just say we want more black faces in high places, you get yourself in trouble. And I think that, we have more black billionaires than we've ever had before. That doesn't necessarily mean that the economic future for black people is better.
You define power as the ability to move something in a direction it would not otherwise go. It's also about making and breaking rules. So I'd like you to elaborate on that and explain how you see power, the essence of power. This word we use a lot, but you wrote a whole book on it, so tell us.
I think power is when you are considered when you're not in the room. I think power is when you sometimes can take on a fight, and sometimes you even lose that fight, but folks don't want the fight the next time. And so maybe some of the things change along the way. Power is about making and breaking rules. And I talk a lot about both the written rules of policy and the unwritten rules of culture, because I think that they work together, right? And how they sort of operate. And communities need infrastructure, they need sort of resources in order to have the ability to shape the outcomes of how society treats them, how things move or don't move. And so, all throughout the book, I give very clear examples of situations where we had built power, and I give situations where we built power and lost power. One of the things I really spent a lot of time with the book is basically for every win or win and a half, I try to talk about a loss. And in those losses, I try to talk about why we lost and what I would have done different. Like, I tell a story of the progress we had made around a lot of mostly it was like cultural progress, but some policies were changing around policing. And we got to that point where Alton Sterling and Philando Castile had been killed. And then two Dallas police officers had been killed. And and President Obama called a meeting at the White House for about 40 folks, law enforcement officials, civil rights leaders, I was part of like the new generation of civil rights leaders that were invited. And for years, I spent time not ever being invited to those meetings, mostly standing outside with petitions. And every once in a while, they would say, you could come in with your petitions. But this meeting, we had gotten to a point we had built up enough of sort of visibility power where they couldn't not bring us into the room, but I didn't know if it meant anything. And so they brought us into the room. There were mayors. The Fraternal Order of Police was there. In true Obama fashion, right, his goal was to develop consensus, right, that there was a problem and that something needed to be done about it. And obviously, those of us who were, pushing for very clear reforms were walking in the room with a set of things that we wanted to achieve. And I talk about this meeting as like how we got played by the Fraternal Order of Police in that room, and how we Joe Pasco, who runs the Fraternal Order of Police, really played us. And so it was one of those meetings that was supposed to be 45 minutes. It actually ended up going 4 hours. It was apparently the longest meeting that Obama had during that period of his presidency, that second term. And he rolled up his sleeves. He ran the meeting. It had one of those meetings where you have to put up your card and you get to talk. And I was and I walked in thinking I was going to sit next to certain people, and they put us in assigned seating, so I had to sit next to.
You got sandwiched.
I got sandwiched between two police chiefs, I think, or a mayor and a police chief, and I was strategically working so I didn't have to speak after Brian Stevenson, because no one wants to speak after Brian Stevenson, but I had to look after Brian Stevenson. It's like the one thing I was like, when does he pull up his card? Okay, and then each of us told stories of being racially profiled. We were trying to lean into Obama's goal of consensus. And as I was talking, the head of the Fraternal Order of Police interrupted me and said, all this talk of racial profiling is new to me. Not, I don't agree with racial profiling, not that I don't agree with your solutions. I have never heard about racial profiling. You all are introducing a new thing. Right? And so this goal of consensus, right, is like getting thrown out the window. Like Obama's goal of thinking that we could get consensus because we have been moving the ball, and that consensus would then help to drive.
But let me find,
Yes.
So clearly he's behind the curve. You can mock him, but isn't that also, if he's open-minded, is there a way to bring him in?
No, the head of the Fraternal Order of Police is not dumb. He is a profiteer. This is about his goal. He walked in that meeting knowing that he had to do everything possible to make sure we didn't walk out the room with consensus. Had we walked out the room with consensus.
But you think he was faking that he hadn't heard of it?
Yes, of course, the Fraternal Police. I testified with him up on the Obama's 21st Century Policing panel just 2 years before. But the idea that the head of the Fraternal Order of Police who lives in this country and at some point in time turns on the news has never heard the term racial profiling.
BS, okay.
Is BS. But, right, we did not do enough work to seed that story with the press, that they never agree that there's a problem. The Fraternal Order of Police, their whole strategy is to deny there's even a problem, because if they deny there's even a problem, then they don't have to agree to any solutions.
Sounds like the oil companies, but that's another story. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Oh, this strategy of pretending like there actually isn't a problem is not, just for Fraternal Order of Police. It is a strategy that our opponents consistently use to prevent consensus. And if we're spending all of our time trying to build consensus and not building power, and hoping that at some point that the benevolence of those that are making money off of actually the thing that we're trying to disrupt. That's why I spend in the 3rd chapter, very early on, after we get through presence and power, so much time on profiteering. Because behind every injustice is someone profiting from it, is someone sort of gaining resources. And if we don't actually approach our campaigns and our strategies from the framework that on the other side of injustice, and I don't talk about profiteering just as making money. And I think that sometimes that's a challenge that we have on the left, is we sometimes think about profiteering as just money. I think Stephen Miller is the greatest profiteer.
This was an expanded notion for me reading the book.
Yes.
It was a different interpretation, because you say profit,
Yes.
I think money.
Yes.
You're saying there's other social, personal,
And this is because if we only think about it as money, then we say things like those white working class people are voting against their interest. And what is their actual interest? Do they think they're going to be upper middle class or rich, or do they want society structured a certain way so they have the benefits and fruits of certain things and others don't, right? Stephen Miller, I don't think, is working in the White House so that he makes a lot of money. He's working there because he wants a society that is structured around race and gender in certain ways where there's certain outcomes that happen for some and not others. And that type of hierarchy is also a type of profiteering. And I sort of walk through how that works. Because if we only see it as money, then we run the wrong type of campaigns. We have the wrong understanding of perhaps what our opponents are in it for. And when I shared some of the early chapters of the book, I had a number of friends, white friends on the left who I've worked with in different places from the LGBT movement, who really struggled by how much I went back to race over and over in the book. And you keep going back to race, and I don't think it's just. Right? I'm like, well, what is it? Help me understand. And to be clear, what I often say is I get that you just want to get over race. You want us to be able to find a way to not talk about race. And so do I.
So
so do I.
So they feel less guilty?
So they feel less guilty because it's hard, because, dealing with this forces us all to have to reckon with things that we don't have to reckon with. We have to reckon with people in our lives that we may love and we want to believe in just the best things about them. We want to believe in the best things about ourselves sometimes. We want to believe that we're not benefiting from inequality or injustice, and sort of, we want to believe those things. And I also don't want to talk about race all the time. And I don't know any person of color that really wants to always be talking about race. But the fact of the matter is our opponents are always talking about race every single day. Their whole structure is designed. If their whole effort is designed about racial injustice, and then we choose to not make racial justice our strategy, we are making a choice to actually ignore the whole game and try to play a different game and hope that something else happens.
One thing that really helped me was learning from Ibram Kendi here that people can be racist and anti-racist in the same day, in the same hour, in the same paragraph, right? We all, many of us have that capacity. And when I think about power these days, I often think of fear. And Donald Trump rules by fear. And you also write that holding power means making nervous other holders of power. Mm-hmm. And you said that before. So I'd like to hear how you think about power and fear.
Yeah. Fear and nervous, all those things I think are incredibly important. So, I'm 5'3". You got to see that. So, I think about strategy in all sorts of ways. And so my dad would oftentimes tell me, don't let your alligator mouth get your Tweety Bird into trouble. And so I've learned over time that you don't go out making threats if you actually don't have the ability to deliver on it, right? That people will call you on it, right? That they that's just how society works. And if the people that we are trying to pressure to do something are not nervous, and this was actually a real framework that James had early on in Color of Change, in developing Color of Change, that when Black people are on their roofs begging for the government to do something in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. Mm. And so we can spend our time developing all the research reports that show the disparities. We can build technology that we think will sort of like tell us where the hot spots are and how do we move. We can build a lot of like beautiful narrative stories. But at the end, if those who are actually in power don't actually feel like they have to do anything, and I tell a story in the first 2 chapters about Katrina through the lens of presence and power. I tell the story of the most visible, most present thing that was probably said during that moment was the words of Kanye West, the old Kanye West, who said, George Bush doesn't care about black people. And so he says that at that telethon. 7 days later, there was a meeting at the Heritage Foundation, 2025, 25 years after they rolled out Project 2025, 20 years after. So this is 2005, Project 2025 comes out 20 years later. But they had a late night meeting that started a process at the Heritage Foundation. That meeting was chaired by then Congressman Mike Pence. And Congressman Mike Pence had a meeting. He was head of the Republican Study Group. And that's where they started to divide up New Orleans. They started to privatize it. They started to put in place all of the things that made it impossible for so many people to return and made it a city that was welcoming to corporations. And the difference between sort of the very visible words of Kanye, which didn't yet have the type of infrastructure to make any of that real, and the sort of infrastructure that made that crisis, that moment, and Naomi Klein talks about this a lot, and others talks about
disaster capitalism.
Yeah. But disaster capitalism requires power. It requires the ability to make and break rules. It requires the ability to take a city that is a very black city where black people are incredibly present. You don't get New Orleans without black culture and black food, and you can then take and make and change all the rules. And sort of understanding how that works and understanding how we lose in those situations is critical if we're ever going to be on the path to winning.
Right. And you write in there that natural disasters are no longer natural, which I appreciated, hearing. Do you want to read that piece from? We have a piece from. You want to read?
I'm going to read
regarding
piece,
Katrina,
yes.
Which was a piece from your book.
Since you're all just getting the book because it just came out this week. Yesterday it came out, and so this is actually my third official stop because we did a stop in New York on the 27th.
Jane Fonda first and then me, so you're in good company.
Jane Fonda, Joy Reid last night in D.C., and then we're here with you, and then I'm here with Lena Waithe in L.A. tomorrow. So a really busy first week. But this section of the book is about perceptions. It's chapter 4, and it's about perceptions defining solutions. I actually like nature a lot. I love the beach. I love the food that comes from my mom's garden. I do not believe that nature has it in for black people. Whenever we fall for the story that an injustice is part of the natural order of things, we are less likely to confront the people who actually cause it. That is why they keep using the term natural disaster. Time and again, people who benefit from the way things are use the idea of nature or natural to explain away the injustices that they themselves create and perpetuate. It's a story that lets them off the hook. Black people are naturally inferior, they say, so however corporations, police, and politicians exploit them is their own damn fault. Being gay is unnatural, they say. So however churches, schools, or corporations discriminate against them is exactly what they deserve. Women are weak, they say, so it's natural for men to push them out the way, because men are strong. And the people who benefit from all of this discrimination, well, they say that's natural too. These are powerful stories that people invent to convince others, as well as themselves, that certain so-called realities are unfortunate, but not unjust. That's the connection between perception and power. What's the logical conclusion of thinking that a bad situation is unfortunate rather than unjust? The conclusion is to give up on the fight for changing the systems that produce that condition and to let the people in charge reproduce it over and over, no matter who gets hurt. The status quo wins with that story. What people are going through may be sad, but what can you do? When something is unfortunate, we blame life, fate, nature, the world. When something is unjust, we blame people. Profiteers never want to be blamed. Irresponsible leaders who make bad decisions never want to be blamed. They care about perception. They invest in managing it. Unfortunate realities lead to charitable solutions, consolation prizes for victims of injustice, rather than solutions that prevent those injustices from happening and giving people the restitution they deserve for experiencing them. And that lets people who cause those injustices off the hook. They might persuade us to think, for instance, that sending water bottles to Flint, Jackson, Cleveland, Detroit, or any other cities with high levels of lead in its drinking water will solve the problems caused by the government and corporations that enable the poisoning of people in those cities. But water bottles are charity. Replacing lead pipes and compensating people for injuries they suffered is justice. The part of President Biden's 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act related to clean drinking water was an act of justice. It forced local governments to replace lead pipes and stop poisoning their own people. That is, of course, one of the federal mandates that the allocations of money Trump and congressional Republicans have tried to cancel. We cannot progress as a society and improve our lives if we invest only in charitable solutions to structural problems. Nothing is wrong with charity inherently. Helping people in need is a good thing. But when it serves the purpose of letting injustices persist, we need to question the people who are telling us that charity should be our only focus. And one of their biggest tools for misdirecting us is controlling our perception, making us think the problem is merely unfortunate and not unjust. When we believe in unfortunate realities, we get reentry programs to support people leaving prison instead of reducing the unjust policies and practices that put them in prison in the first place. We get celebrity concerts after the hurricane has already hit and wrecked people's lives instead of levees that could have prevented disaster. Charity is just a consolation prize. We are being trained to think we need to live with injustice rather than believing we can eliminate them. We are being duped into thinking people are victims of life itself rather than victims of people in power.
So that made me think of something during the Biden administration, the White House Environmental Justice Action Committee, Dr. Bob Bullard, Catherine Coleman Flowers. There was a real effort to have, for the first time, this was a big deal at the White House level to have environmental justice. What came of that? Did that change the headline and not any structural power?
I think one of the challenges that I consistently dealt with during the Biden administration, and I would have these calls with them right before each of the State of the Union addresses, the Domestic Policy Office. I would also have calls with them during other periods of time too, but before the State of the Union address, we would have these calls, and many of the policies were exactly the policies.
Yep. You're good. Okay.
Many of the policies were exactly the type of policies that we wanted. I think a lot of the things that President Biden moved forward were actually, in some respects, more progressive than many of the things that President Obama moved forward.
Interesting.
They had a real challenge with telling people a full story. And over again, they did not tell people a full story of who and what was standing in the way of change. And they were unwilling over and over again to really name the corporations. When we talked about policing, they were unwilling to talk about police unions and the other forces standing in the way. They were unwilling to actually tell us who we had to fight and who we had to overcome to get these great proposals. It was just sort of like we need enough Democrats, and enough Democrats will help us. But we did not create a full story about hero and villain. And what Donald Trump was so excellent at doing, and what the right is excellent at doing, is that they fill that story in with trans kids and black people and immigrants and women, and then people have a story. And so it wasn't, and so part of what I really tried to do with this book is to not be in a story of a list of policies that we need to work for and win, because I just don't know how useful that is. If we
More white papers.
Yes, if we don't have an analysis of power and how we get there. If we don't have an understanding of how we take on the forces that stand in the way of the change, and then how do we think about politics different? One of the things that I really open the book with is how the right has changed politics. And they've done it they've made it a participation sport in a very different way, right? People wear their red caps. You go to the gym and they change the channel to Fox News. They are like proud of who they are, and every environment they're going in, they're reshaping it. And we can sometimes almost be embarrassed by, and not you all, because
Also,
y'all
the
are
flag,
here.
waving the flag has
They are
been totally...
waving their flags and being, not you all, because you're at the Commonwealth Club on, in the middle of the week, like talking about these issues. But on our side, we haven't created roles for everyone at the same level. We treat politics almost like it's like going to a Knicks game. The team is on the court, we're commenting, we're like upset that the Democrats are not doing enough, or we're going to the theater, we're watching the folks on the stage, we're commenting around it. But they've made it so that they all have roles. And as a result, they have shifted what is expected from their leaders. I tell this story in the book about right after Donald Trump got elected, and a group of us went to go meet with Senator Schumer, and we were all worried because if you remember, there was this open Supreme Court seat. And so Donald Trump just not only got elected, and a lot of people in D.C. were surprised, but now he had a Supreme Court seat. And Senator Schumer assured all of us of two things. One, he assured us that there were enough institutionalists in the Republican side, like Orrin Hatch, he named as one, that would never get rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court justices. And because these institutionalists cared so much about the institution. And what ended up happening was Donald Trump and the environment of MAGA changed what the job description was for Republican senators. And they had no choice but to change what their behavior was. Senator Schumer also told us that he felt that he could work with the incoming Attorney General Jeff Sessions because they worked out together in the gym. Yes. And that they had a good relationship. And in both situations, it was this understanding of politics and this understanding of how what was changing about power that I think was just totally a misread. And so I, over and over again, will hear people say, where are the Democrats on this? How come we're not getting enough from the Democrats? And I think one of the things I do in this book is at the end of 9 of the chapters, I've created what I call Find Your Power sections. They are exercises at the end of the chapter. Because I think that more of us have to sort of be invested in a different type of relationship with our engagement. And the Find Your Power is about finding your power in the singular, meaning when I think about how the right wing shows up, to libraries or to the school board meetings or to all the environments that they're in, more of us have to sort of recognize where are we placed in the world? What do we have access to? If we have 5 minutes or we have 5 days, how are we going to use it to engage in the things that we care about and using our sort of individual resources to make a difference? And then it's about finding our power in the plural. Because we all have to find our people. We all have to be engaged. And those sections really do ask you to, at the end of chapters, kind of move from the analysis of what I'm trying to offer into action. Because also producing a book and going around talking about it without giving people things to do and ways to engage is deeply unsatisfying for me. And so my hope is through these Find Your Power, the 9 that got into the book, and then the other ones after my publisher said I couldn't go over 400 pages, the other ones that will be online, which in my opinion are interventions around helping us operationalize narrative, helping us operationalize racial justice as a strategy, helping us operationalize some of these frameworks so that whether you're taking on a local library or a school board, or you want to be part of the fight to take back Congress, there is a role for all of us in that. And hopefully walking people along a pathway to engage. Because if we are going to sort of get out of this mess that we're in, the strategies of waiting for our leaders to lead us is not going to help us. We are going to have to find new ways of engaging. We're going to have to find new ways of finding our power. And part of why I both wrote this book and I'm trying to make these interventions as I travel around is to invite people into a new way of thinking about themselves and their role in what's to come.
And a new way of thinking about narratives. You have a chapter on winning narratives, and you write the quote, "The power of direct control is ordering your kid to go to their room. Yeah. The power of narrative is making your kid think that their stuffed animals are lonely and waiting for them to come home, so they choose to go to their room on their own." So unpack that for us and relevant to politics today, because we hear so much about changing the narrative, controlling the narrative.
Uh-huh. I'm a good uncle and a non-parent, so I did run this by a couple of parents who found it funny and told me that I could use it. But I wrote that, and I think about narrative is what people believe, whether it's true or not. And I think a lot of times we talk about changing the narrative, and we think if we just say something that people will then believe it. And then if we say it long enough, but people need experiences. They need ways of being in society. We need new rules that over time force new behaviors. And I really learned this during my time at GLAAD. I got to GLAAD in 2005, where what you could say in the media or a larger culture and at the workplace about gay people was radically different than what you could get away with in 2011. And that didn't mean that homophobia had went away. That didn't mean that people were all of a sudden totally accepting, right? Or they are today. But there were a new set of rules. In that new environment made people have to respond differently. And there were a whole set of strategies that led to it. There was a whole set of research that showed that gay people were not talking to their friends and their family about being gay. They just were not having those conversations. So we had to actually start with our base. We had to start with the people in the community to have people not just come out, but then to have more conversations with people that they didn't really want to have conversations with about things that they didn't want to talk about.
And one conversation you had was with Fox about Glee.
Absolutely. I remember being right before Glee went on the air. And they were worried, and they were trying to tamper down the openly gay high schooler because they were going to get pushback. And Fox is a profiteer. Fox does one thing over here on the news, and they'll make money on other things. So they knew that there could be some money to be made, but they were trying to hedge their bet. And we had to build sort of a campaign of protection around that character because we knew also with both narratives and with so many of the policies, once you can change the floor, what's acceptable, you can push up the ceiling on what's possible. And you'll never see now a show about high schoolers that doesn't have some type of queer representation in it. A new rule was created as a result of a whole body of work. And that new rule of those type of representations also directly coincided with the strategy that we needed around more people having conversations, about more people being out, because we knew that was a strategy that created more acceptance, created a stronger base of people who were not part of the community that were willing to fight for the community, that were willing, and if they weren't willing to fight for the community, they were willing to maybe not accept certain things that they were willing to accept a year before or 2 years before. Changing standards and changing what's acceptable, right? That's how to think about narrative, not just we want to tell a bunch of stories. Now, within that, stories can be tactics, right? But if someone doesn't believe in gravity, for instance, there's no story I'm going to tell them that's going to change that. I need to give them experiences to help them understand that gravity exists. And there are a whole set of stories about Black people, for instance, that people believe that are not true. And that dictates as well how close to the edge people will get, how close to Black people they will get, how close to Muslims they will get, how close to Jewish people they will get, how close to LGBT people they will get. How we disrupt those stories is not just through the messaging. And, another way to think about narrative in direction to messaging, and I say this because I think that we confuse it a lot. We just hope we can say something a certain way and people will be like, oh, you got us, and I'm going to change my deeply held belief. is narrative is kind of like, and I don't know if this might not go over well in like Silicon Valley area, maybe my computer stuff is not right, but narrative is kind of like an operating system. And messagings are like apps. And you can't put the wrong app on an operating system and expect for it to work. And what we oftentimes do is we go out and we say things inside of environments that are not ready for them, that we're starting in the middle of a story for people. People will shake their heads at us, but they don't actually believe us and they're not with us. And I do think that sort of once again, how we sort of build a base, and that's why I go back to this finding your power section, because just nothing I've ever done, no work I've ever done, has happened without a base of people sort of willing to fight for it, willing to engage, willing to see themselves as part of that work. And that's one of the first ingredients to winning anything.
You're also sticking with narratives and shaping culture and shaping narratives. You're working with Jane Fonda, who has this organization to protect the First Amendment with writers and producers. This is building on something her father created during the McCarthy.
He was part of, yes.
Yeah, he was part of during the McCarthy era. So what are you doing and what are you trying to accomplish by working with creatives? You know, you've worked with Glee before to protect that gay character. Mm-hmm. What are you doing now trying to shape culture and power before it's seeded in advance to the authoritarian push?
Well, I've always seen the work of shaping various sectors of society, right? So there's in the final part of the book, the final section of the book, it's divided into three sections: understanding power, building power, and the practice of power. And the practice of power section, there is a whole chapter on Hollywood where I talk about going into crime procedural shows. You can't change the criminal justice system if you don't disrupt the stories that actually incentivize people to believe certain things about crime and race and cities and safety. And so kind of recognizing the role of celebrities and helping to reach people. We don't have a 24-hour news station on our side. Anyone who thinks that corporate-owned MS Now, or it used to be MSNBC, is like ours. I have so many stories to tell you about how they blocked us till the very end talking about net neutrality because Comcast owned it at the time, and Comcast was not with us on net neutrality. And so we don't have a 24-hour news station. We don't have a network of radio stations. What we have oftentimes is people with the ability to reach other people. So organizing celebrities, keeping people aligned is so incredibly important. The co-chair of the steering committee, who actually Annie Leonard, who's here, who called me to come to one meeting with Jane Fonda just to help them think about the committee. And somehow now I've been, for the last year, been in meetings after meetings. Thank you, Annie, because it's been great. Jane is tireless, and a couple of things that I think is so important. We need people that are willing to push the edge to make the water safe for other people. And she does that consistently. Having worked with celebrities, many of them are just afraid that they're not going to have another job after the last one. And there's reasons in this current environment to believe that, right? Big tech is taking over Hollywood, and they are buying up it all, and they will blacklist people and make it really hard. And for artists of color, it's even harder, right? And there's just less roles to even start off with. And so Jane both going out and really pushing and saying things in powerful ways and still working, I think is a very good sign because it does set an agenda. But also the strategy of recognizing that we need to both challenge the industry to not be, a pillar holding up the authoritarian regime. We also need voices that can reach people and move them into conversation. And then we also need to find ways to leverage the actual thing that Hollywood does well, which is shape stories. And so, I knew when I went into the writer's room for a lot of different things. I was a producer on the Dahmer series, the Jeffrey Dahmer series on Netflix. And, people are like, why would you do that? I was like, more people will see this thing than any op-ed that I'll ever write. And for 10 episodes, we got to shape how police failed, why they failed, people got to be angry the whole time. And now this is not a thing I would normally watch, but like it was during the pandemic, and so I'm like sitting at home sending Ryan Murphy notes of like, this is too many dead body parts. But it got to the point where like we told a story of the police unions. We told a story of Jesse Jackson showing up, which he did during 1989 at the height of his power and fighting for police accountability. We showed that there was agency among gay black men in that community who were fighting back and trying to make the issue clear. And those stories were told because we were able to like shape an environment that wouldn't have otherwise existed if it was just a classic crime procedural show. And so there's a lot of power in Hollywood. There's a lot of power in the tech industry. There's a lot of power in sort of all of these spaces that can either be for us or against us. And part of picking the right fights is also recognizing that our fights have to go to the places that are sometimes standing in our way. And so even as like folks ask me about like another March on Washington, I'm like, well, perhaps, sure. But the March on Washington that folks keep trying to create happened after department stores were sort of, brought to economic destruction in the South. Bus companies had to change their policies. Cities were brought to heel. There was a whole organizing strategy. So by the time folks got to Washington, D.C., there was the potential that those in power were nervous about disappointing them. So back to this idea of forcing people to be nervous about disappointing you, that is so incredibly important to being in a place where you actually are not just heard, but you have the potential to be heeded.
Let's go to some audience questions here for Rashad Robinson. Here, you describe yourself as someone who was part of Black Lives Matter movement, even while being clear-eyed about what it did and didn't achieve. And you compare this to the civil rights movement, which had smaller participation. Black Lives Matter had a lot of participation. So how do you hold both of those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes right into the presence to power framework, right? That numbers alone, the amount of people that show up to a rally or a march, media wants to say, oh, this many people show up to No Kings. Well, where did they show up? What were they disrupting? I think No Kings is incredibly important because it's an on-ramp and it's how people are finding their people and how people are engaging. But the next step on the ladder of engagement has to be forcing institutions to feel like these people who have showed up are now going to take the next step. They're going to make it hard for me to have business as usual. They're going to make it hard for things to consider, because as long as those in power, the people who are making money off of Donald Trump, playing see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil, right? As long as that is acceptable, then we're going to continue to have the status quo. And so I think, and I do it throughout the book because I think it's important that those of us who are part of campaigns that won talk about our winning. And then when we're part of campaigns that lose, we talk about that as well. And we talk about why we lost, because I actually think that there's something in this kind of moment we're in that I think is partially due to like the feeling that there's just not enough money, how we have to raise money, how that we call things that were not successes. And we talk about things that they won, or we didn't win, but we changed their narrative. I'm like, how did we change the narrative? And I think if we're all willing to interrogate ourselves more, I think we can also, on the road to build more trust in the people we hope to mobilize.
Another one from the audience. Progressive movements are often built around visibility, as you've been saying, metrics, marches, hashtags, viral moments. Conservative power, however, in your account, was built by avoiding visibility. Is there a version of quiet power?
I mean, I think there is a version of quiet power. And I mean, they don't avoid visibility. I mean, I fought Focus on the Family and the Traditional Values Coalition and their church institutions. They like visibility too.
Project 2025 was put out there in public.
They like visibility too. So I think that they have lots of visibility. They understand how to then use their visibility and channel it to like force folks to know that like, if you don't do this thing, these are the consequences that you might face. And I think like just visibility without sort of thinking about it through the lens of leverage. You know, those years of where we were sort of building our campaign around Facebook. And to be clear, the Facebook work was happening in the way it was happening because we were not in a place to get regulation. I don't want to like go beg, you know, corporations to regulate themselves. Self-regulated companies or unregulated companies. But I remember we were like at the table with senior level folks, and Facebook was like, "We're here in good faith," you know. And then we found out from the New York Times that they had put out that they had hired this company Definers to attack Color of Change and attack me and try to like undermine what we were doing. And so at that point, we had a different type of leverage, right? We were mostly behind the scenes, and we were saying some things publicly, but we were mostly behind the scenes, trying to expose problems, but meeting with them in good faith. At that point, we're at a point where now Facebook had to do something different because we had built a certain amount of visibility that could be seen as power. And they had to meet with us at the senior level. So we met with Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg regularly. I remember going out to their offices and they wanted me to sign an NDA before meeting with them. And I said, no, we can't sign an NDA. You've been attacking us. So they made me wear this badge that said no NDA on it. Yes, we walked around the office.
Scarlet letter.
And I think I was like the first civil rights leader that went there that had to sign, that had the sign on. And afterwards, other people started to not sign the NDA. But anyway, because I didn't sign the NDA, I'm able to talk about both the behind the scenes and what's out front in this book in ways that I think will be really interesting to the reader. Outside of the more stories that will make some of people mad about anyone who cares about women of color being talked down to in certain ways and hearing how Mark talked to Sherlyn Ifill and Vanita Gupta or things like that. But what I really talk about in this book, and I try to make clear to us, is how do you know the difference between whether you're in a dialogue versus a negotiation? And far too often, we mistake being in dialogue with our targets, which is where they want to keep us. They want to be able to say, I'm talking with those folks. And this is all kind of connected to this idea of visibility. We had the meeting. We met with those black folks. We met with those climate activists. We met with those women. We heard them. We understand what their concerns are. We're taking it seriously.
And those people think that access is influence or power, and it's not.
And they're doing everything they can to stay at that table, right? And so once you get to that table, now you're trying to figure out, how do I keep getting invited to the next meeting? The Obama administration did this masterfully. So for years, but because I was never invited in the beginning, I didn't even know what that, you go in the White House and you get M&Ms and stuff. I didn't know any of this. So it was I was outside with the petitions. I say all that to say the difference between being in a dialogue versus a negotiation is the difference between presence and power, right? And negotiation doesn't mean you're going to win everything. It doesn't mean you're even going to win, but it means you are in a place where you have built up enough power where they either want you to do something or stop something, where they need you in some way. And we have to have a higher standard for the type of things that we're doing in our campaigns. And part of what I was trying to do with this book as well is give the consumers of our movement enough insight so they can have a higher standard for what they expect from movement organizations. Because far too often, we see leaders going into meetings that are just dialogues, and they are trying to say that they're meeting on behalf of us and doing things, and then they're not actually doing anything. One of the reasons why I didn't sign the NDA is because I didn't want anyone to be able to say what I said and didn't say in the meeting, and then me not be able to say, oh, that didn't actually happen. No, I didn't take any money. No, this part of it is recognizing that if you represent a constituency in the world, then you have to actually do the thing for that constituency. But part of those of us who are the constituency is we have to demand more things of the people who represent us, whether they are movement organizations, whether they are elected officials, or whether they are corporations who come to us and say, buy our products or use our services.
And we've been talking about profiteering in a monetary and non-monetary sense. And we have a question about capitalism can be a powerful force. And there's a debate right now about capitalism and socialism in this country with the rise of democratic socialists. How do you think we can do justice work even if it's anti-capitalist?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting, this is like a thing I wrestle with a lot too, because, I was having like dinner with these people in like Midtown Manhattan, and, it was this like lovely woman who I met for the first time, and she was asking me about my book. Her and her husband, they were very well dressed, and she was like, I don't know about what you're talking about with these campaigns. I don't think any of this, we can't do any of this work until we just dismantle capitalism. And I was like, interesting. And I was just like, you're not serious. Like, you're about to, they were paying for dinner. I was like, y'all about to, so I was like ordering what I wanted. And I was like, y'all about to spend $200 and $300 for dinner. I know, I'm a gay New Yorker. I have an idea about how much those shoes, cost that you're wearing. And you're sitting here saying we can't do anything until we dismantle capitalism. This means that you are really not interested in the suffering that people are experiencing in their lives right now. And you are not being serious about the things that we have to do to actually make some changes, even if it feels incremental to people. And I can sometimes feel that there is this sort of middle class, college educated thing that happens where the only change that is acceptable is the total dismantling of a system that the people who say it are not even invested in doing. They're not making any paths or steps for. They can't tell me any of the dismantle capitalist organizations they are tithing to at 30% of their money. They're not doing any of the serious things that if they were actually serious. And so I sometimes get really sort of, just as a person who's actually run campaigns, has had to show up to corporations and represent a community, has had to spend the week before figuring out how do I not get played in this meeting? Or how do I set up the meeting ahead of time with Coca-Cola or with AT&T or whatever so that we can get the most out of a situation? And then to have people say, well, we just have to dismantle capitalism. I'm have at it. But give me a plan that actually looks like that, a strategy that makes sense, a theory of change for how you actually get people invested in that story. These are not even people who are have built churches or things where they get people to show up once a week. You have to, so part of what I am trying to offer also with this book is something that is both real and practical, because I do feel some of the ways in which we talk about social change are not in ways, and some of the ways in which the folks that, get to lead, I remember some of the fights I had with people about defund the police. And I really resisted saying defund the police.
It doesn't even appear in the book. I searched for defund the police. It's not in the book.
No, it didn't. It didn't. And there was a place where I was trying to talk about it. And then, there's this thing that I learned from writing a book, from the people who write books and from your editor. All the people, you have to kill your kittens. And it sounds awful, right? But you have to kill. So there was a piece about defund that was that's a cutting room floor. But, defund never said what we were for. It only said what we were against. It never really built a base. Meaning that you go into any black community and you say defund the police and people want to know, okay, who do I call when something bad happens? But it was aspirational in a way that the policies that were put forward around training police or diversifying police forces or any of those things are not actually real. And so I would sit in a lot of meetings where people say, oh, we just need more training for police. And I'm like, okay, well, what happens after the training? And then if the police keep doing that, so we do have to find ways I do talk about in the book the difference between a real solution and a fake solution, and being real with people about what the difference is. Because as much as I just sort of like, I just said that whole thing about capitalism and socialism, I think in a lot of places, what we're seeing from democratic socialists is real solutions, is folks taking on things and offering up real solutions. I'm watching my mayor of New York offer things that feel like real solutions.
Free childcare.
And that to me is delivering on those results. That feels real. That feels like, how do we do this? How do we make this economically viable? How do we change who's responsible and accountable? That feels real, and that feels like we're in the game and we're actually doing something that makes sense.
Of the 4 areas you cover, corporations, tech, government, and Hollywood, which do you think progressive movements currently understand the least, and why?
Oh, wow. I also cover culture too. I would say Hollywood, and big tech. We understand the least, because I think we delve into a lot of magical thinking when we think people are on our side. And I think it goes back to the profiteering section, where that we can sometimes believe if people are on our side that they'll do things that will allow them to make less money. Just because.
It's the whole sustainability thing in the 2010s, net zero. There was a time when corporations are going to be part of working on climate, and then that just is all evaporated. We've made us look like fools, maybe, that we thought that they were going to.
Yeah. I think that's healthy to say, I think we went in with a certain hope and idea that something was going to happen, and it's okay to say that, like, we got duped, because if we don't say it, then we're going to get duped again. Right? If we don't actually say it, I hear a lot of people talk about, like, we need to find the business case for these issues. It's because we have fallen into the trap of our opponents. We are using their language. We have to find the business case. And if we find what if there is no business case? On a whole bunch of climate stuff, there is no business case. Right? There is no business case on certain things that we care about. And do we not work for it? And why are we not shifting the frame? If we are truly engaging people, how about we how about corporations have to start creating the justice case? How about we start forcing our opponents, especially in places like blue cities and blue states, where these folks have to go and get contracts? What is the justice case? Who are you not hurting? What is actually helping? How are we on the road from actually trying to fall into our opponent's frame to creating a frame that they actually have to sort of speak to and engage with? Shifting the incentive structure, I think is incredibly important, but it's going to force us once again back to sort of like the very beginning of the book, to see ourselves different in a different way, to see ourselves as participants in a different way, to be proud of the things that we care about, to not hide, to going back to like the LGBT work of coming out as progressives in all of the spaces that we're in, to not, whisper it, but to be loud about our values. And then when people don't stand with us, to almost look at them like they're the crazy ones. And the more that we can sort of create an environment where we sort of create the conditions where, like, of course you're with us on this, I think the more we show up in ways that, like, get our leaders to do things that are different.
So we've been talking about getting power. I want to ask you a question about using power. There's a real debate right now looking toward the midterms of what happens if the Democrats take the House. And there is one school of thought, which is principled accountability. Heather Cox Richardson is out there going back saying, the Confederate were never held accountable for basically treason. Nixon was pardoned, that the Democrats should go after Trump whether or not they can succeed or not, they should impeach him. And that's a principled approach. And the other approach is, no, that's a waste of time. It's going backwards. Even if he's removed from office, you have a president, J.D. Vance. That's not a good place to be in, which is more tactable use of power. So how do you think about that use of power in that moment?
Well,
that possibility.
I don't know if we have the right players to do the thing that Heather's talking about. I agree with her. And so I have been talking a lot about where are we putting our energy in terms of the type of accountability that we want. Because I think what's going to happen is that if we win back Congress, the base of people who want accountability are going to be deeply unsatisfied by what Congress does. There are going to be reports and some speeches and maybe some hearings, and it's like not, I mean, it just,
nothing's really going to change.
I don't know how, I mean, Hakeem Jeffries has more heat for Bernie Sanders than he does for, AIPAC and corporate tech. He will quote Biggie one day and then be at an AIPAC meeting the next day. And I don't trust them. What I do think, though, is that there has been a lot of movement energy around putting, and I talk about it in the book as changing roles to change rules to get different results. And there's been a lot of work around progressive prosecutors and progressive attorney generals, and a lot of energy. And I think that that's the space where accountability might live. And I think that that's the space that if we want to both make demands and make heroes out of folks, if we want to create the incentive for what's happening on the Paramount merger is a direct sort of result of an environment that was created by a lot of movement groups and movement organizations, and the Committee for the First Amendment is one of them, that created an environment where AGs that were willing to step out also felt like they would be supported, that they would be a world that they could step out into and they could push. And so your AG out in California, my AG in New York, a number of AGs are now stepping out. We're watching progressive prosecutors in a lot of places take on ICE in ways that I think is really important. And the prosecutor, which I was involved with getting her elected in Minneapolis, was sort of key in like stepping in and finding the footage after Renee Good was killed and Alex Preddy was killed, and being able to engage in a different way. So I just think that like where we put our energy is going to be really important, and who we make heroes in this moment. And I just worry that if we are making heroes out of our congressional leaders, we're going to be deeply unsatisfied by what they deliver, and it's going to be a real challenge as we head into 2020.
Right. Elect the right people, and everything will be okay. So we've been talking about pursuit of power, use of power. On a close, asking about your own power when you were in power. Color of Change was a big organization. It had a big impact on racial relations in our country. Starting with Bill O'Reilly and more. In 2023, the organization reportedly laid off about a dozen employees and was racked by internal turmoil amid allegations of sexual harassment. In September of 2024, you stepped down as president. The Union of Color of Change issued a statement saying it was appreciative that your toxic leadership was coming to a close, and said your unprincipled messaging created a narrative disconnected from reality. So what did you learn about power from that experience?
Yeah, no, I mean, a couple of things I think that's important about that era. The union was running a campaign, and I'm a good teacher. And
nothing more like a bunch of liberals turning the guns.
No, I mean, they learned how to run campaigns from one of the best. And and so there were like days where I was like, bravo, that's good. We running a nonprofit means that there is no profit. I made no profit. When there's no money to pay people. And that is just sort of the environment. I do take it on in the chapter called Magical Thinking, because I do think in that chapter, I think it's incredibly important for leaders to sort of think about what they learned, where they made mistakes. especially as we think about sort of a path forward. You know, as I reflect back sort of on that moment, the organization grew very fast. We were trying to respond to a moment where sort of there was an influx of resources and we didn't want to hoard them, that people were giving the resources for us to go out in the world and do it. I should have known, and I should have been probably more clear, that like people's appetite for Black people, Black organizations having power and resources is like episodic and it's going to go away. And I'm not sure how much of a donor you've been to Black organizations, but when I go around and talk to most white people, they probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about how they've donated to Black organizations, how much resources they've put behind that. And so in that moment, there were a lot of expectations on how Color of Change was going to engage. We took on a lot of issues, but we also were doing that during a pandemic. So people just did not get to know each other. We were hiring people and they didn't have relationships with each other. We were doing it at a time where like people had family members dying of COVID. There was just a lot happening, and I spent a lot of time just focusing on trying to win as much out in the world, and not enough time probably trying to figure out like how to like run the business of an organization. I didn't write a book about running a business of an organization because because I've never thought of myself as a nonprofit executive. I've always thought of myself as a social justice leader. And in America, you sometimes, as a social justice leader, you run a nonprofit. But if I was living someplace else, I might be running some other sort of vehicle. I also think that there's there were a lot of articles written that would have never been written had Color of Change not had visibility, how I had not had a lot of visibility. And there was a way in which, like my story about Gravity, people distanced themselves from Black leaders and Black organizations when they go through those fights. And so I learned a lot about like the fickleness of kind of support and admiration and all those things. But I also learned a lot about the type of people that will stand with you in those moments. The people that can like see through what's actually happening in those environments. And I don't know any leader that I've ever admired that's ever accomplished big things, that hasn't had bad articles written about them, that hasn't had staff upset about them. I'm sure that there's probably people here that don't like you or haven't felt good about your leadership, and I don't know who those people are, and I hope they don't write articles or tweet about you. But I know that like being a leader and being a person that has to make tough decisions doesn't mean that you get to be like dimples and smiles all the time, although I'm that a lot. You have to make tough decisions. You have to sometimes make decisions like we cannot afford this, and we have to let people go. And in those environments, when you do that, people are going to be upset and they're going to be angry. But Color of Change still exists right now. It has a leader who's doing really great work, who's taking on Goldman Sachs and other organizations. And if I had not made those decisions, there'd be no Color of Change right now.
If you're not having some power, then you don't get attacked, right? It's a sign of influence, actually. Yeah. Our thanks to Rashad Roberts.
I like to not end on that point, though. Okay. I like to not end on that point. I like to because I also think it's important because our movements don't always feel hopeful and aspirational. They don't always feel like places where people want to come and be involved and engaged. And one of the things I always try to like center in the work at Color of Change, and less so in GLAAD because I wasn't in charge, but it was there at GLAAD too, is this concept of joy. And joy is not the absence of pain, but it's the presence of possibility and hope and aspiration. And I also, like, throughout the book, try to, like, include places and spaces where joy was as, like, a central strategy for how people took on fights. Because underneath why people do this work has to be a culture of belief about people believing something better for themselves and their families and their communities, and that they're willing to fight for it. And so I'd like to end on that point because everything I've ever done has really been about people being willing to like stand up. Like I remember back in 2006 going to Alabama and training LGBT couples to like put same-sex wedding announcements in in the newspaper, where the announcement could have been put in on a Sunday and they show up to work on a Monday and they're legally fired. But people still were willing to do it because they thought that this was part of a larger strategy. And if they could disrupt and show themselves as fully part of the community, that would be on the way. I think about like formerly incarcerated people that I worked with around Ban the Box and other issues, and like standing out in front of the White House with petitions, and then the White House saying, no, they couldn't come in for a meeting. And then us, like the other leaders saying, no, we're not going to go in without them. And then the White House actually, in that moment, having to change the rules of who could go in the White House and who could not go in the White House. People believing something better for themselves and their communities is so critically important to making any of this work. And so I know that we are in this moment where the authoritarian takeover can just make it feel like every single day we're hit with the worst possible things, and it feels like we may not get out of it. But I hope that we can remember both joy and we can remember a culture of belief and possibility, because those are the things that will fuel any of the strategies in the book, any of the sort of work of taking on big fights, is that we need people that believe something is possible, believe more is possible, and they're willing to do something for it.
Way to take us to a better close. Thank you, Rashad, author of From Presence to Power. Our thanks to Rashad Robinson, author From Presence to Power, How to Take on the Fights That Matter and Win. I'm Greg Dalton. Thank you all for joining us here at the Commonwealth Club. We encourage you to get a copy of the book out there. Rashad will be available to sign them, and we can have a little reception and hang out. Thank you all.